Welcome back to the deep dive. Usually when we talk about a huge company, we focus on, their biggest hits. If this were about McDonald's, we'd be talking about the Big Mac.
Right, the quarter pounder.
But today we're doing something a little different. We're looking at the experimental menu, the McPizza, the McSpaghetti, all the weird, niche, and sometimes totally disastrous ideas.
That is a surprisingly good analogy for what we're getting into today.
We are looking at DC Comics, but not the Superman and Batman you know. We are diving into the history of their imprints. These sub-labels and side brands they've used for 40 years to try and sell comics to everyone who wasn't already buying superhero comics.
It's a really fascinating way to look at the company because on the surface, DC is this monolith. You've got the Trinity, Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman. They are the establishment.
Right.
But for decades, they've been running these little internal labs, these imprints, to see if they could sell romance or horror or high-concept sci-fi.
So for this, we're drawing from the list of DC Comics imprints and the history behind them. Our mission is to kind of figure out the strategy. Why does a company that owns the most famous characters on Earth need to invent other company names just to sell a book?
It all comes down to audience segmentation. Think of it like a brand wrapper. A parent trusts the Disney logo, right? You know it's safe.
For sure.
But Disney also puts out R-rated movies. They just do it under a different name, like Searchlight. If you put that Disney castle in front of a really gritty war movie, you'd confuse everyone and damage the brand.
Yeah, you don't want a 6-year-old accidentally watching a crime drama.
Exactly. So an imprint lets a publisher like DC say, okay, this stuff is for kids, this shelf is for goth teenagers, and this shelf is for people who, like abstract art. It protects the main brand.
So let's go back to when this really started. I know DC published under other names way back when, but this modern idea of the imprint as a strategic tool, that seems to start in the late 80s.
That's the pivot point. The late 80s were a wild time for comics. The whole medium was growing up. You had Watchmen, you had The Dark Knight Returns.
Right, proving comics could be serious.
But DC didn't really have a place to put the stuff that was, let's say, a little risky or just plain weird.
And that brings us to 1989, the launch of Piranha Press. Even the name sounds aggressive.
It does, doesn't it? It's not a place for Superman rescuing a cat from a tree.
Definitely not.
Piranha Press was DC's first real shot at the alternative market. You have to remember at this time, underground comics, with an X, were starting to bubble up. They were raw, black and white, counterculture. DC wanted in.
So what did a Piranha book actually, look like?
The flagship title was this book called Beautiful Stories for Ugly Children.
That is an amazing title.
It's evocative, right. Piranha was experimental, it was weird, but the key thing here, the thing that really mattered for the industry, is that Piranha was the first place DC allowed for creator-owned titles.
Okay, let's pause there. Why is creator-owned such a big deal?
Well, in the main DC universe, if you write a Batman story, DC owns it. If you invent a new villain for Batman, guess what? DC owns that villain forever. You're just work for hire.
Right.
But the underground scene was all about ownership. So with Piranha, DC could say, come here, make something weird for us, and you get to keep the rights. It was a way to get talent that would never touch a corporate machine otherwise.
That seems pretty ahead of its time for 1989. Did it work?
Creatively, yeah. It produced some really unique stuff. Commercially, not so much. It shut down in 1994. It was maybe a bit too weird for comic shops back then.
But they didn't give up on the idea. Piranha dies, and in 1994, Paradox Press shows up.
Paradox was an interesting pivot. If Piranha was the punk rock club, Paradox was more like a smoky jazz bar. It was all about nonfiction and gritty crime stories.
I was looking at the list of Paradox books, and I saw something I did not expect. They published Road to Perdition.
They did.
The Tom Hanks movie. I had no idea that was a comic book, let alone from DC.
And that's the Paradox legacy in a nutshell. It was a graphic novel first. It's a perfect example of what an imprint can do. If that book had a standard DC Comics logo on it, people would expect superheroes.
Sure, or magic or something.
Exactly. But putting it under Paradox told bookstores, this is a serious, period crime noir.
They also had those big book of series. I definitely remember seeing those.
The big book of urban legends, the big book of conspiracies. Yeah, they were these thick, digest-sized books full of weird folklore, huge cult hits. But again, despite that, Paradox folded in 2001.
It seems like these things have a shelf life of, 5 to 7 years?
Usually. But then you have the exception, the Juggernaut, the imprint that basically defined a generation. We have to talk about Vertigo.
Vertigo, yeah. Even if you don't read comics, you've probably seen that logo. It feels like it was more than just a publisher. It was a whole vibe.
Vertigo changed everything. It launched in '93. But here's the smart part of the strategy. Unlike Piranha, which started from scratch, Vertigo took books that were already successful but pushing boundaries like Swamp Thing, Doom Patrol,
And just moved them over.
and moved them into this new neighborhood. So they didn't have to build an audience from zero. They brought the audience with them.
Darn.
And then they added the killer app, Neil Gaiman's Sandman.
Which is basically literature at this point. It's on college reading lists.
It is. Vertigo became the home for that British invasion of writers. Dark fantasy, horror, sophisticated drama. It wasn't about punching bad guys. It was about philosophy and magic.
And it lasted way longer than 7 years.
Decades. In the 2000s, they revitalized the line with Fables, the fairy tale characters in New York, and why The Last Man. It became a seal of quality. You saw Vertigo on the Stein, you just bought it.
There's a funny story in our notes about a failed sci-fi imprint that sort of fed into Vertigo. Something called Helix.
Yes, Helix. In 1996, DC thought, sci-fi is big, let's do a sci-fi line. It failed. Miserably. Lasted 2 years. But they had one book that everyone loved called Transmetropolitan.
Which is a cyberpunk classic.
Totally. So
Yeah.
when Helix died, they just moved Transmetropolitan over to Vertigo, and it fit perfectly. But the funnier part about Helix is the name.
It wasn't always going to be Helix.
They wanted to call the imprint Matrix. Yeah, they had the logo and everything. Then someone realized there was a movie coming out called The Matrix, and they thought it might confuse people.
Wow. Imagine if DC owned the trademark for The Matrix right before that movie changed everything.
A bullet dodged or a massive fortune lost, who knows?
So we've covered the mature angle. But DC was also going out and buying other people's companies. This brings us to the late 90s and the acquisition of WildStorm.
This was a huge deal. In 1998, DC bought Jim Lee's studio. Jim Lee was a rock star artist, and this brought in a whole new universe of heroes. The Authority, Wildcats, slicker, more modern, a little more violent.
But inside that purchase was something really interesting. A sub-imprint called America's Best Comics.
ABC.
Yeah, that was Alan Moore's playground, the writer of Watchmen. DC basically gave him his own sandbox inside the WildStorm deal.
And that's where we get the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Exactly. And Tom Strong and Prometheus, see what they're doing? They're using imprints to offer different flavors of superhero. Main DC is your classic. WildStorm is extreme sports. America's Best Comics was, like, vintage literature.
But Alan Moore and DC, that always implies some drama.
Oh, it does. And eventually the relationship soured. The line folded, the characters got absorbed, but for a while it was the most acclaimed corner of the industry.
Speaking of different flavors, I want to talk about the alternate reality imprints, because this is where things just get weird. Specifically, Tangent Comics.
Tangent is a wild one. 1997, the idea was, what if we take the names of the DC heroes but change literally everything else?
I'm looking at the descriptions here and my brain is breaking. In Tangent, Superman is not Clark Kent. No. In the Tangent universe, Superman is an African-American police officer named Harvey Dent.
Harvey Dent, who's usually Two-Face.
The very same name. But he has psychic powers, not super strength.
And the Flash.
The Flash is a teenage girl who is literally made of light. She's a celebrity.
This sounds both terrible and amazing at the same time. What was the point?
It was creative chaos. It proved the IP was flexible. You could stretch these names until they almost broke and people would still check it out.
And this sort of leads into Elseworlds. That's the one I think most people recognize. The logo that just means this story doesn't count.
Exactly. Elseworlds started in '89 with Gotham by Gaslight Batman versus Jack the Ripper. The whole mandate was just take the characters out of continuity and go nuts.
And that kind of evolved into the All-Star line in 2005, which was less about alternate history and more about celebrity creators.
That's a good way to put it. All-Star was DC's answer to Marvel's Ultimate line. The idea was to create books you could hand to anyone. No 50 years of backstory, just the iconic version of the character by the best people in the business.
And we got All-Star Superman from that.
Which many consider one of the best Superman stories ever written. It is perfect, distilled Superman.
We did. We also got All-Star Batman and Robin.
We did, which is infamous. Written by Frank Miller, drawn by Jim Lee. It was always late, it was controversial. Batman calls himself the goddamn Batman, and it never actually finished.
Wait, really? They never finished it?
The last 2 issues are still unpublished to this day. So the All-Star imprint gave us the absolute highest high and a very, very confusing low.
Okay, I want to pivot here. We've talked about genre, we've talked about alternate realities. But what about when DC tried to change the format of the book itself? This is where I think the business side gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Minx.
Minx is such a classic case study of right product, wrong time. Launched in 2007. The target audience, teenage girls. The format was digest-sized graphic novels, like a manga book.
Which makes sense. Manga was exploding with that audience.
Totally. They saw girls buying Fruits Basket and thought, we need something for them, but not superheroes. They launched books like The Plain Janes, a drama about art and high school.
So why did it fail? The notes say it was gone in a year.
The books were well reviewed. It wasn't the content. It was the bookstores. This is the big lesson. Distribution can kill a great idea. Random House was distributing them, and they had no idea where to put them.
What do you mean?
Well, back in 2007, a bookstore had a comic section with Superman and a young adult section with novels. Minx books were comics, so they got shoved next to Watchmen.
So the teenage girls looking for a high school story in the YA section never even saw them.
Never saw them. They couldn't bridge that physical gap in the store. Minx died in 2008. But look at the market today. The biggest growing sector is YA graphic novels for girls. Heartstopper, Raina Telgemeier. Minx predicted the future. They just couldn't solve the shelving problem.
That is just heartbreaking. Being too early is the same as being wrong.
In business, it absolutely is.
They also tried to predict the digital future with Zuda.
Zuda Comics, 2007 again. This was a webcomic site, but it was also a competition. Creators would upload their comics, users voted, and the winners got contracts.
So like American Idol for webcomics.
It really was. And it produced a fantastic winner called Bayou. But DC shut it all down in 2010. And the reason is simple. The iPad came out.
The iPad killed it.
The strategy shifted overnight. DC realized they didn't need a special website for scrolling comics. They could just sell digital versions of their regular comics through an app. Zuda became redundant.
I want to touch on the license stuff really quick because DC also spent time, it seems, just renting other people's toys.
They did. In the late 80s, under the TSR imprint, they did Dungeons and Dragons comics. And then there's the whole Archie situation.
Like Archie and Jughead.
No. Archie Comics, the company, also owns a bunch of superheroes. The Shield, The Fly. DC licensed them in the 90s under Impact Comics to sell at newsstands to beginners. Didn't work. They tried again in 2008 as Red Circle. Didn't work then either.
Why does DC, the company that owns Superman, need to rent The Fly?
It's about filling market gaps. They thought these simple classic heroes might appeal to younger kids where Batman's convoluted history couldn't. Turns out, kids just wanted Batman.
So bringing us closer to today, the strategy seems to shift again around 2016. We get the era of the pop-up imprint.
This is the boutique phase. Instead of launching a huge corporate line like Vertigo that's supposed to run for 20 years, they started giving the keys to a celebrity curator for a limited time.
And the big example is Young Animal.
Curated by Gerard Way.
The lead singer of My Chemical Romance.
And a very accomplished comic writer. He did the Umbrella Academy. DC gave him a corner of their universe and just said, make it weird. He called it Comics for Dangerous Humans. They revived Doom Patrol and a book called Cave Carson Has a Cybernetic Eye.
I would buy that based on the title alone.
It was fantastic. It was psychedelic and strange. It captured that early Vertigo energy for a modern audience.
And they did the same thing with Brian Michael Bendis when he came over from Marvel.
Right. They gave him Wonder Comics, which focused on teen heroes like Young Justice and the Wonder Twins.
And the absolute weirdest one, Hanna-Barbera Beyond.
Oh, this was a trip. They took Saturday morning cartoons, Scooby-Doo, the Flintstones, and did these dark adult reimagining.
Reimagined is putting it lightly.
Right.
I saw the cover for Scooby Apocalypse. Shaggy is a muscular hipster, and the monsters are real.
It was insane. And the Flintstones comic was this biting social satire about consumerism and war. It was critically beloved. But again, these were pop-ups. They weren't meant to last forever.
Which brings us to the end of the line, the death of the imprint.
The great restructure of January 2020.
What happened?
DC decided to streamline everything. They looked at all these brands, Vertigo, Minx, Zoom, Black Label, and just said, this is too confusing. So they killed almost all of them.
Even Vertigo.
Even Vertigo. It was really the end of an era.
So how do you know what you're buying now?
They replaced imprints with age ratings. Now, books are just labeled DC Kids for 8 to 12, DC for 13 plus or DC Black Label for 17 plus.
Black Label sounds like a brand of whiskey.
It's pretty much the only true imprint left. It's the home for the mature, out-of-continuity stuff. The first book was Batman, Damned. It's basically the new Vertigo, but it uses the main superheroes.
It feels a little, I don't know, clinical. Vertigo felt like a club you were in.
Yeah.
DC 17 Plus, it feels like a warning label.
You're hitting on the core tension there. From a business side, it makes sense. You want the DC brand to be the star. But from a fan perspective, you lose that identity. Being a Vertigo reader meant something in the 90s.
So looking back at all this history, Piranha, Minx, Young Animal, what's the big lesson? Was it all just a waste of time?
Not at all. I see these imprints as R&D, research and development. Piranha proved that creator-owned deals attract talent. Vertigo proved comics could be literature. Minx proved a YA graphic novel market existed even if they couldn't reach it yet.
So even the failures taught them something that helped them later on.
Exactly. The DNA of these failed imprints gets absorbed back into the main company. DC evolves because of them. If they just kept publishing Superman comics the same way they did in 1950, they'd be out of business.
It's an ecosystem. The weird little mutations help the whole thing survive.
That's a very poetic way to put it.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. But before we go, I have a question for you and for you listening. We talked about these pop-up imprints curated by a celebrity. Gerard Way got one. Brian Michael Bendis got one.
It's a powerful idea.
If you could hand the keys of the DC universe to anyone today, a director, a novelist, a musician, who would you pick and what kind of books would they make?
Oh, that's a dangerous question.
I'm thinking a horror imprint curated by Jordan Peele.
That would sell 1 million copies. Or maybe a high fantasy line curated by George R.R. Martin, although the books might never come out.
Too soon.
But seriously, think about it. It shows that the potential for these characters is just limitless, depending on who's steering the ship.
Let us know what your dream imprint would be. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Keep reading.
We'll catch you next time.